welcome, especially for those who kind of made a trek. I know, like, I realized from being in Berlin that you don't take transportation for granted, because at any given moment, you could be faced with like, hey, there's a strike, right? Pepe, where did you leave the, oh, there we go. All right, I'm gonna come over here. I got a couple different things planned for today, because to me it's a meetup, although it feels like a keynote with the size of the people in here at this point. But I like to make sure that we are keeping things a little bit intimate and practical when you come to a meetup, because that's the vibe that you get. But we're going to talk about integrating generative AI into the software lifecycle, especially in the context of testing. But we'll see, people, when they say testing, they mean a lot more than actually just testing. So we'll talk through some of that and get to it. So my name is Tariq King, for those of you who don't know me. So I'm the business unit head for Test.io as of January 11th. But I also support a lot of EPAM's testing practice, as Sohaib mentioned, in different areas, including obviously software testing, engineering excellence, and a whole bunch of things. In a former life, which is kind of where we're going to start, I had a different hat, and it was a very strange transition to me from being a software tester into being the chief scientist of a startup company, and also leading ML engineering for their platform. But we saw a couple things a few years ago that I want to kind of actually go back to, because it leads us to this point. So we'll try to run through. But back in 2015, like, I was actually still employed at Ultimate Software, which is an HR and payroll company. And we were leading a lot of things, including an initiative to see what would the future of testing look like. And basically what happened was, one day my boss walked in and said, hey, what do you think the future of testing is going to be like? And I said, well, I think in the future, like, we're going to start to realize that we can't just be focused on a lot of this manual or human present testing. Because this is not a bad thing, right? Like, this is an art and a skill and a craft when it comes to software quality that is de facto. Like, if you have good skills in testing, you are an asset to an organization. Yeah, you might not be as respected as you probably should be, but you are definitely an asset to the organization. But there was so much focus on manual testing, and even what we call automation was very manual, right? Like, what is automation in the testing world? Well, you still got to craft all your test cases manually. You got to go through that process, all the design thinking to come up with those. And then you still got to manually actually create the scripts, right? No one's generating the scripts for you in those days. And then you get to execute something automatically. And then the minute it fails, you're back to the manual process, right? So back then in 2015, it was like, man, there's got to be a better life than this, right? It's got to be a better life. Got to be a way where we can look forward at, like, to automatically generating scripts and just getting better. And me and a buddy of mine, Jason Arbin, actually formed a little association. And we had like 3 main areas, right? Again, this is 2015 when I drew this diagram, talking about moving towards AI-driven automation, right? Being able to use AI to automatically generate tests and evaluate results and this sort of stuff. And then understanding that to do that, you need to be able to test those AI systems, because now we're depending on AI to do all sorts of fancy stuff. And an intrinsic part of the future of that is that, hey, these systems, even once they're built and deployed, can now adapt or do very dynamic things. So maybe we need to design them with testing in mind, which is all great, because it was like, man, testing is actually going to become a little bit more important in people's minds than an afterthought, right? Now testing should take a proper position in the software lifecycle, and we'll talk about that. I even wrote a little book, right? Like a little, I don't know, article, I don't know, call it whatever you want. I wrote something down about this topic, and O'Reilly published it, and there was a lot there. There was a lot of the experience that I had building machine learning systems to test applications automatically, right? So we built bots to do UI testing, and then we also applied that now to testing applications across domains, right? Testing the entire app store was a very big vision to look at testing in a new way, but AI gave us new capabilities even back then. So when we start talking about ChatGPT, which we will, just understand these models were around from before, but it just weren't in everyone's hands like it is today, right? And then, other cool stuff you could do with AI is test games and test video streaming. So trying to tackle some of the hardest testing problems, but also recognizing that, hey, this is looking like AI could actually start to take over multiple aspects of testing. Core foundational things, right? Different levels of testing, and then cross-functional things like performance. So we did experiments on usability and performance and so on. Just, again, it's in the book, right? And I don't get paid anything for that book, by the way, so this is not a plug. I don't get any royalties whatsoever. Anyway, and then also recognizing that the future of testing was wound up in this kind of adaptive machine learning or this dynamic behavior for software. This was our future. All right, so now we fast forward into 2023, and then we were hit with like generative AI. Well, we weren't really hit with generative AI. Generative AI was already around, as I mentioned. But now, like, it was very much apparent because everyone was using these tools to create new content, whether it be natural language or videos or images. Like, we could use GenAI to do a lot. And I had a lot of fun last year at the Agile Testing Days conference, playing games with people. Like, is this a real person? Is it AI generated, right? Yeah, you'd have to be there. Hopefully you'll be there this year, right? But no, these are all AI generated photos. And this is AI generated art. And the thing is, like, you can't tell the difference. And I know this because I tried it with a lot more people than you in this room right now, and people failed. And it was cool, right? Because it was music, it was everything. It is very difficult to figure out if something is human authored or AI generated in this day and age. And it's our favorite chatbot, right? How many people use ChatGPT? Let me see. See, my kids did not raise up their hands, right? Trying to keep them away from that as long as possible. But I use it, not to parent, but I use it for other things. But we'll have to see. Maybe parenting is a good path. But what this did was make AI believable, right? And these are things that I've said. And this is really cool because now we're in an age where everyone is starting to think about the future. And so the cool thing about EPAM is, like, we engineer the future. Like, when I saw this tagline, I was like, okay, I got to be a part of this company. Like, this is just too cool for school. And actually, like, yeah, it looked cool, but like actually witnessing it on a day-to-day basis is actually even cooler. And this whole AI thing showed me that, right? So when we started thinking about what are we going to do with this influx of technology and interest in generative AI, like, we got straight to it, right? So one of the first things, and I actually presented on this topic in Cologne at Agile TD Open Air. So what Pepe didn't tell you is that they sometimes have a conference on the beach in Cologne. Sounds unfair, but I gave a keynote in my swim trunks. True story. And back then, it was the beginning of my journey with EPAM and thinking, like, hey, you know what? AI can be a force multiplier for a lot of what we do in engineering. And what do I mean? What is a force multiplier? It means that we can get gains, productivity gains, right? So now we can do more with less resources or the same resources. Pretty cool, right? But this topic came up because, like, I saw us at EPAM starting to get into a lot of experiments using generative AI. And when I say a lot, I mean, I thought I worked for a big company before. I was 5,000 employees when I left Ultimate Software. Nothing like 50, 60,000 people. And a whole bunch of people mobilized to try to do experiments using a single set of technologies or focus, right? A lot of use cases. And so the whole goal there was like, hey, let's look at what is practically useful when it comes to generative AI. Can we start to run experiments across the life cycle? And probably like within a month, I saw something like 1,200 use cases just flood in the gates. And over 400 of those were related to quality engineering and testing, right? And that's actually like what brings us here today, is because like we're talking about the life cycle, and we're talking about more than testing, we're talking about quality. And you know, quality starts and testing should start from the beginning and the inception of your product. It's not an afterthought. So this is what I mean when I say testing, like it is a lot broader. And so we need to be thinking about what does an AI-assisted engineering process look like. And so the first thing to recognize is that before you even start, you need a solid foundation of engineering excellence and practices. If we're going to talk about increasing productivity, then you better have a baseline for how productive you are. And what does that even mean? How do you measure it? And understanding that it is something that needs to be holistic and not just focused on one group or individual. Because if you optimize, I don't know, the development team, now they're spitting out a lot more code quicker, did you actually improve or increase productivity? Well, it depends. Can the analysts actually keep up with that pace that they're building at? So can we actually get requirements in quick enough? When it comes to testing, are we able to actually have the throughput on testing to get those things out of that queue, or is it just building up in a queue? So it's not just a simple problem of thinking about one aspect or activity. Of course, AI can definitely improve on the local level, but now how do you think about the holistic process, right? And so you need to have this holistic view, and it starts with agile practices, things like shift left, quality engineering, and then recognizing that within each area, whether it be requirements gathering, then there's tools that can support, right? And methods that can support, and use cases. And so we're going to step through like some of these aspects and bring it kind of close to home with testing, and then hopefully like have time, I don't know how I'm doing on time, to look at some actual, so I'm doing good. So we started actually a little bit early, Pepe, right? Because 5:30 to 6:30 is this leg, right? I don't know, we'll see. Anyway, once we're having fun and I don't cut into anyone's time, I'll feel good. But yeah, let's talk through some of these things. First thing to understand here is when you start talking about requirements engineering or requirements solicitation, like there's a huge potential. So this is Manoj. Manoj is actually based in the UK. And I met Manoj like pretty early once we started investigating GenAI for quality engineering. And he just reached out to me on Teams, because EPAM, they live and die by Teams. At least TestIO uses Slack, so I feel like, yeah, making a step in the right direction here. But Manoj said, like, hey, I had this idea. And I heard that you're the quality guy, the AI quality guy, so like, let me just talk to you about it, right? And he said, well, I had this idea, like, I'm a lead business analyst, and like, I was thinking about ChatGPT, and I was wondering, like, hey, what if we could actually, like, just capture conversations with a stakeholder, right? And record that as a transcript in Teams, and then feed it to, like, ChatGPT, and then have it start analyzing the quality of the requirements in that discussion, and then maybe even using that discussion to generate requirements automatically, right? So he was like, hey, take this transcript, we're discussing some features, let me get user stories generated automatically, let me ask to review and validate those user stories and say like, hey, do we have a complete list? Is there anything missing from the roadmap, right? And now all of a sudden, like, you're doing AI-driven testing or validation of requirements. And then he's like, well, okay, if we could do that and we get a set of user stories, then couldn't we start generating tests and generate test cases from those user stories? And Manoj is like, well, you know, I'm not a tester, but like I can use this ChatGPT stuff, and he can get to that step. And then he was like, okay, now we're here, and we have test cases, which I can understand. I can realize that they map to these requirements that we have. let me just try to see if we can generate test code. Like, can we actually generate test scripts? And this is where Manoj stopped and said, like, hey, like, look, it started generating the code. I had no idea what it was doing, but it was generating the code. Looks right to me, but like, I don't know. So I was like, Manoj, you know what? Like, you're on to something here at a very early stage. And this is like thinking about a few things that really help us to deliver software better and faster. The first one is we need to think across the life cycle, not just within a given role. Business analysts, of course, like they can deal with user stories and requirements. That is their world, that is their domain. Maybe it's not a stretch. I've met really good business analysts that know a thing or two about testing and can take that acceptance criteria and make sure that, hey, we're covering different scenarios, which is in essence testing. But then the line usually stops there. Not that they're not technical business analysts, but then the train stops there. And so therefore, if the train stops there, maybe that there needs to be some level of review. Maybe one person can't do it all, right? But maybe having checks and balances along the way and having different roles collaborating here and using AI to help, then maybe we can actually integrate this into the life cycle as a whole, because we're not saying that AI is replacing the entire team, right? So anyway, Manoj did his experiment. It was pretty cool to watch it happen. And he presented it at a conference and presented it internally and actually formed the first set of some of our use cases that were generated. And that was awesome. And now you see tools like this. We actually built a tool, and we'll talk about this, that is baked into Jira, where you can do this kind of requirements-based generation as a plugin. Like there's a plugin we released on the Atlassian store called AI Genie, or Genie, I don't know how to pronounce it. But that AI Genie tool is like, generate epics for me from these descriptions, like, and bring it into the role of that requirements engineer, right? And then supporting there, now we're seeing AI being used for user design. And this is really cool. I think this has audio, but I don't know if I set up the audio. But when I saw this, I was like, this really brings a different spin to it, so we can watch it. Yeah. I think we have audio. Hold on, let me. One second. I'm gonna actually try to see if I can switch the audio. Since we have it, we might as well use it. Sound. Let's see. See? Might as well try. All right, so this tool called Wizard lets you actually generate UIs, mockups automatically, right? Using prompts. I was like, man, we're really going places with this generative AI, right? It's not just about text. It's not just about language, but also using that language and those prompts to actually create this kind of acceleration on software. So now we can generate the acceptance criteria, which normally are kind of mapped and intertwined with things like mockups, right? And not only are these mockups, these can actually not just wireframes, but these can be actual UI designs that probably could then be quickly translated into an app. And then I saw this, and I was like, wow, okay, so not just UI design, but let's now step into the world where we're actually building. And there's a tool called Eraser.io, and they have this wonderful tool called Diagram GPT, right? And actually, let's see if we can do a live demo. I thought this was pretty awesome. And basically what you have here is that you can actually get it to automatically detect like the type of diagram that you want it to, or you could select from a list, right? So you can then generate sequence diagrams or entity relationship diagrams or cloud architectures or flow charts, right? So here I'll just say generate a sequence diagram that shows a user logging into an e-commerce application and adding items to a list or maybe their cart and checking out. All right. And then click generate. Oh, diagramming error, programming error. What was this? Hold on. Do I need? Oh, I already generated too much diagrams here. Well, let me try something. Let me see if we can trick the system here. Because I wonder if I go incognito here, if that will make a difference. Let's just see. Hey, I'm a tester, man. I'm just checking out.
Sir.
I don't know. Just checking out if it's possible or not, right? Man, I should have copied let me not write that again, right? So hopefully this is a workaround, right? Don't do this at home, kids. Let's see. Guess it worked. We edit those parts, right? So here it is, like before our eyes, like building out a sequence diagram. Like I wish I had this kind of tool when I was doing software engineering in college, because we had to draw a whole bunch of sequence diagrams, right? And sorry about the quality here. Actually, maybe if I do this, we'll see. But you get the idea, and it looks good on my screen. But man, all sorts of diagrams and all sorts of cool generative stuff, not just like text. I mean, nothing wrong with text. We'll see how useful it is later. But this to me was a step in the right direction. So now, like, the process can be, like, let generative AI do some of the heavy lifting. And then what are we doing as human beings? Maybe reviewing, updating. Like, this is certainly better than starting from scratch, hopefully. And then if it actually got some of these flows right, and a human user can look at it within a few minutes and say, like, yep, you know what, this is good. I think this is missing. Then that just saved me some time, right? And it saved me some time not at the cost of quality, not at the cost of, just skipping steps. So testing is part of the workflow, right? All right. Anyway, don't get around the system like that. That was just, pure luck that worked. Never tried that in my life, right? All right. So we got, oral requirements being translated and generated into acceptance criteria. We got UI mockups like coming out of nowhere. And we got design diagrams, right? So what are we missing now? Well, just code now, right? And that was one of the first things that they started doing with these text-based generation, right? Like, let's have something like GitHub Copilot and have it not just do IntelliSense, right, but generate entire blocks of code. Whose code was it trained on? I don't know. That's probably a legal thing you should ask yourself before you embark on this journey. But nonetheless, we can generate entire functions. And then, in generating entire functions, step into a world where we can now do software testing on this generated code, right? Or any code for that matter. And it's pretty cool. Like, we've built a whole ecosystem here called Alita. I'll demo that in a bit as well, which really is a part of our answer, because there's a precursor to Alita that's pretty important, but is a part of our answer to getting towards a place where we can securely, safely, and responsibly use AI in the software engineering lifecycle. And it is really more about the value of how you bring it to your teams that I'll talk to you today. Like, this is not anything that I'm trying to sell you, as most of our tools and infrastructure are generally free and open source. I'll point you to some open source ones today. But it's really about, number one, what we've seen people asking for, like different clients and how they're approaching this, because people are very interested in using this for testing, specifically for testing in these types of scenarios that I described today. And like, how can we make sure that we can do it in a way where you're not actually putting your organization at risk? Because sending your queries to the public OpenAI API is not the safest thing for you to do. They're not necessarily enterprise ready. So we'll talk about that. And then there's report portal, not to get away from like, hey, it's not all about generation of tests and all this stuff. Like, analytics and reporting is still a key area where AI shines. And report portal is one of our open source tools there. All right, so let's talk about testing, because we're at agile testing days, and as we talk about testing. And, you know, as I mentioned before, there's several use cases. What task I had at hand with me when I had those 400 plus quality engineering use cases was like, hey, how do we start to really roll these up and figure out what is valuable from what is not? Remember, it was an experimentation mindset that we proposed. And this is one of the cool things about being at EPAM. Like, people think very quantitatively. They want to think about how we can show metrics to really determine if something is working or not. And there's nothing wrong with, you know, qualitative data, right, anecdotal data, but having, you know, some tangible things that we can latch onto is important, right? But a number of use cases, everything from designing test cases, right? So the analyzing requirements and generating test cases we talked about. We also talked about code-based generation, right? So executable scripts, and we'll see how that looks like once we start talking about Alita. But there's a lot of planning activities as well, right? So it's not just that you just jump in and start testing. There's usually a lot of planning and figuring out, like, what is the best way to allocate resources? What do you need to do next? What are the priorities, right? A lot of that work, and it is work, takes a lot of time. And so if we can accelerate that, that's also important. Test case maintenance, right? There's duplicate test cases is another thing that people suffer from in their organization. There's another one of those very popular things that we get asked to help with. Like, can we dedupe these repositories? Can we dedupe our bugs? Like, we're just wasting time because there's just so much repetition, right? And that can be a value add in terms of like reducing that technical debt, test data generation, and then analyzing results and defects and so on. So these are the high level use cases when you start talking about incorporating AI into your testing activities or your testing lifecycle. And it's important to know that there's different techniques at play. One of the first things that you'll see and that we'll talk about is this idea of prompt engineering. And using kind of like this natural language, like queries to guide the model is very useful, right? It's easy for anyone to use, really, right? So there's a very low barrier to entry to start using the technology like this. But there's also a limited context that you can provide it when you're taking this approach. If you want to analyze a lot more, for example, if you want to analyze a whole bunch of logs, right? I mean, you could try to break up your logs into chunks and feed it to a large language model in that way. But really the correct approach, right, would be to encode it using what are called embeddings and have it take that full context as an embedding, right? Machine understands ones and zeros. There's no reason why the full context can't be provided if you encode it and feed it to the model. So vectorizing that input, very cool. We also do that. But that requires another level of expertise. That's not a low barrier to entry like prompt engineering. It's not the highest barrier, like our thing that you can do either, but like it still is, right? But that will allow you to have a broader context. So whereas over here you can do things like create high-level requirements or test cases, over here now you can do things like analyzing production logs or test hierarchies. You can get deeper using embeddings. And then If you really want to get nerdy on AI, I mean, I learned all this from Pepe, remember? So, I'm still learning, right? But you can get into the world of trying to fine tune your large language model, which is really trying to say that you're adding further training data to tailor that model to the specific task that you're doing. And this is even more expertise, even more time required on that front. But you can get a very customized and even improved results. As we all know, which we'll talk about in a second, like these models can make up stuff, right? Yeah, here's a requirement that you missed. What? Brand new, doesn't exist, never even said it. But it's very convincing when it talks to you. This is a problem. If you care about quality, this is a big problem. But yes, you can do things with very framework-specific test generation if you start looking into fine-tuning. And I flash up this just to prove that we are very metrics-driven. We don't make this stuff up. But really, this is just a story about the two levels here, right? You can certainly measure things at an individual level and look at how quickly you can start to develop tests, right? So your test development velocity, or how much results you can analyze, and a given individual can analyze. Those things can get locally better, right? However, if you're not measuring this as a team, then you're missing the point, right? Because now, you optimize for the individual, and now the team is bottlenecked, right? So team level metrics is also very important. And so, all right, so we kind of got nerdy. We got one demo. We're going to see a couple demos to finish. Hopefully I'm still doing good on time. I think so. But I'm in a room full of testers. We can't just talk about how things are all rosy with GenAI, right? There's definite challenges, right? These benefits, just understand that these benefits come with challenges. I just finished, it took a little portion of my life writing 3 articles in the span of a month and a bit, or maybe 6 weeks, on testing AI systems, right? Because as much as the activity is great, that we're seeing a big push here, and this is exciting, because testing needed some of this technological advancement and TLC, to be clear. There's still a lot of things that we need to guide folks through and that we need to navigate through ourselves, right? Number one, security and privacy. This is something you should always think about, depending on what you're using, how it was trained, and who owns that intellectual property, right? Are you running it on your own infrastructure or not? Because that is going to dictate if you're able to even do this to begin with, right? You need to understand how to interact with these models effectively. It is not just that anybody who can ask a question can do this right. And there's actually a little bit of a scientific process here where prompt engineering is this iterative thing where you feed it a question, you look at the output, you tailor that prompt, and you keep going in that manner. For sure, if you ask the wrong question, you'll get the wrong result. Sometimes you ask the right question and get the wrong result as well. So understanding that hallucinations are real and that you can have these tools generating a lot of artifacts that to the untrained eye appear accurate, but are not. And this is the danger behind some of these tools. And then, obviously, like I told you, measuring productivity gains is not a trivial problem, and not falling into hey, I could do it faster, so it's way better because I can do my job faster. And you're killing someone else's job. If they're hurting because they got all this bad code that sorry, just picking on developers now. They got all these bad tests that they got to review that just came out too fast and you didn't actually take the time to review them yourself first, right? All right, cool. I think we're doing good and we can start having fun. So, a couple of things, EPAM's response to security and to safety and to getting towards a place where we have a comfort level with leveraging generative AI tools is through what is called AI DAL. And this was open source a little while ago. There's an application that allows you to deploy what I'll demo to you today and show you, which is kind of look like a chat GPT interface, but on steroids. It's kind of how I like to describe it. But the main point behind dial is that like there's a way for you to have a selection of the cloud that you want to use, have it be private, have it be enterprise ready using Azure AI or Google Vertex AI, whatever your preference is, and understand that like you can integrate like your tools and infrastructure through all of that in a very secure way, right? So think of it as a proxy to that world. And then it has some bells and whistles, right? All right, cool. So hopefully this didn't die over here. Let me come over here. We still have our guy. We bypassed, and then this is still here. All right, cool. So this is the AI dial chat interface, and hopefully I'm still on the VPN, but I'll find out. I don't need to be on VPN for this part, but the other parts I do, right? So one thing to realize is that the beginning of this is that like while we have like a chat GPT interface, like we actually have access to like a whole set of models and assistants, right? So now like it is really your model of choice, and there's some cool little features that actually let you compare two models and stuff like that. It's in the same query that we'll look at. But that's the first thing. A lot of this stuff configured behind the scenes allows you to look at not just models, right? You can filter by models, assistants, and applications, right? But the whole point here is that you can do things like, for example, talk to our pre-sales assistant, right? So you can define something internally that uses a large language model but might be trained on, no, I don't know if this is any good. This is not about whether or not this assistant is well built, but you get the idea, right? You can have some expert, right, codified as a model, right? Or this could be, just your typical GPT-4s and these things. The other thing that you'll see on the side is that like I have some structure over here for actually organizing prompts, right? So for example, this is a prompt about requirements. I can get here and edit this prompt so that you can see what's going on here. And this is where I felt like I should mirror my screen, but we will tackle this in a different way. All right, so what is this that's going on here? Well, I can store a prompt, which is really just a query, right? It's just a string, a set of questions, right? But I can structure it in a particular way, right? So I have a name for this prompt. I have a short description. So this prompt, for example, accepts feature request descriptions and automatically formats them into user stories, which sounds like a pretty cool thing to do. And then this is my prompt. And you can see like some prompt engineering going on here where I've clearly like stated my mission, the input, the output, I guess the format of my output here. I'm going to generate user stories and use all sorts of formatting for them. And then at the end, I have like, here are the incoming feature requests, and I have this thing which really represents a variable. So we'll use this. Let me just grab like a user story. Get over here. Here we go. Let me just grab some text here. Just because I'm lazy. All right. So here, what I can do, I can put a /, and then I could basically choose like whatever prompts are populated on my local machine here. And I can say, okay, I want to format feature requests as user stories. And you can see like here, that feature request variable basically allows me to populate like just one field, which is basically going to take my feature requests as input. So this is almost like, becomes like a small application now. And I have some feature requests, and I submit it. And now you can actually look at like the entire prompt, right? So the mission is the same. It just copied all that stuff, has the formatting. And then here are the incoming requests, and then my variable is populated there. And I can submit this, and of course, then lo and behold, we have user story generation from like some text, right? So what are some of the lessons here or messages here? Number one, like you can see that, of course, anyone could ask a question, but usually how this works for me is that I go through a process of asking the model to do something and figuring out what things are. That helps me to refine my prompt. It helps me to make sure that I can have a good, well-structured prompt that is useful and reusable for a given task. And if this is the task that I'm going to do a lot, then now I can just click, paste, or type in my, feature request, and all of a sudden, like, I have my well-formatted user story, right? Similarly now, I can go from that and say, hey, I want to generate tests, right? In a similar way, it might now take my stories as input, right? So let me kill this, because I'm not going to do that. But what I can do here, let me just copy this user story. Well, let me get rid of this, actually. Boo. Yeah, no, I'm good. I just was hoping it would annoyingly get out the way, like, easily. But of course, like, live demo, so it wants to give trouble. All right.
To the right of the headline, there's a...
Don't worry. I'm good. I know you want me to copy it, like, as badly as that, but I'm very stubborn. I like to do things my way. You ask my wife, she'll tell you how annoying it is, right? And then I could generate tests here, right? What did I just do? Okay, cool. And then I could generate test cases and go through the whole shebang. Now, this is all good. However, one of the things that we're not really getting to here yet is integrating. The title of this talk is how to integrate this into your lifecycle. This chat interface is pretty cool, but this is not necessarily integrated into my lifecycle. Like, hey, if I have a manual tester or someone who's a quality engineer and they're living in this ecosystem already, then why not allow them to use this interface, right? And bring a lot of those reusable prompts to them in this interface, right? So that now they can say something like, create test cases, and now they get a similar thing where they have their variable, you can input your request action, and now you brought that same user experience of being and chatting with, this chatbot to help you with some certain parts of your job into their world, right? So always think first about the communication channels in the organization and how you can bring AI into those communication channels, whether it be Teams or Slack or whatever you're using, I don't care, Yammer, blah, blah. Like, there's always to extend these things with AI, and you're going to see more and more of these features. You see them already, right? Microsoft is doing it all over with all of their Office products. Like, AI is coming to the software and living with you in the software that you use, right? All right. Now, the one challenge here, I could generate test cases, but that doesn't really help me if I'm a developer. If I'm a developer, I live in this world, right? If I'm an SDET, I live in this world. I can generate code over here. I can generate code over here. I could, but it doesn't compile in any of those things. It compiles right here, right? So again, and we'll wrap up by looking at how all this actually comes together, but what we did with the Alita project is actually create some plugins that plug right into your IDE. So this is the one for Visual Studio Code. There's one for IntelliJ, right? And the idea here, if we just look at the extension settings, is that you can basically configure what LLM provider you want to use. The setting of Alita actually allows you to use a custom. So this is actually pointing to EPAM's infrastructure. So we have like our stuff deployed on our carrier platform. But if you were using directly Microsoft Azure's OpenAI or OpenAI straight up, one of our digital platform teams has their own setup and configuration. But the idea here is that you configure your API tokens and so on and so forth. And then you can just start using the Alita features within your IDE, right? So just to show you how this will unfold, I have a test project here. Let me close this. So this is a set of projects that I teach a course at some of these conferences on unit testing. So I just pulled my unit testing project in here. So there's classes like account or checking account. It's just a set of Java classes. But what you can start to do now are things like this, where you can, select a given class. I'm going to select the entire class. And I can right-click. Let me show you one thing first, right? So a couple things. Your prompt library, we talked about the prompts, and I showed you the prompt library within AI DAO. These reusable prompts, once you figured them out, now those prompts can live in code, right? They can also live on the server so that they can be shared with everyone else, right? But here are some examples. Like I have a prompt here called add unit tests, and it kind of just very basic, but it can use variables from the environment. So in this case, I'm using a Java project. So this would read, act as a senior Java developer. I need to understand the code below and then add unit tests based on best practices. Like you could go crazy here and do all the prompt engineering in the world that you want to do here. The whole idea here is just that it lives in the code with you. And then once you right click, you can hit Alita and you can now go to predict and you can select one of those prompts. I'm going to add unit tests. It'll say somewhere down here, it says Alita is baking your answer right here, if you can read that. Oh, there you go. Wow. I guess if I hover over it, it pops up. So Alita is restart Visual Studio Code to apply latest updates. I don't want to do that right now. Thank you. All right. So thankfully it worked. Live demos never work, especially when they're being recorded. Thank you very much, ATD. But now it's generated a whole Java class that represents unit tests that cover different scenarios for this banking application, I guess, withdrawing valid amounts, throwing insufficient funds exceptions. Again, like this saves a lot of time. One thing to recognize though, here, especially, and this is more of a unit testing practices note, right? That this is generating based on the code, right? So definitely should be reviewed with the perspective of what is the code supposed to do, right? Nonetheless, like this is a good start to figuring out like what are some of the scenarios that need to be covered, especially if I'm starting to thinking about exercising the different code paths. So combining this with a good review process and also understanding that you can use the same kind of interface and models to introduce requirements in here to say like, hey, this code should do this, right? So you can feed it a context. That context can be the code base, but that context can also be a requirements document. And said, hey, consider all of these requirements when you start generating tests for these particular code blocks, right? And now you have a very powerful way to do test generation within the IDE. Compile these things. I've actually seen, so one of the cool things that we do is that we actually feed, so you'll see some settings here within Alita. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Within Alita, where you can actually do things like sync embeddings, right? Or sync external prompts. So typically what we do, especially if there's like a customer that has like their own custom framework, right? Because, ChatGPT has been trained on Selenium, but it hasn't been trained on your specific version of Selenium called, I don't know, Pepe-lenium, right? Just making this up. So because it doesn't know anything about Pepe's custom framework that he made while he was like, dancing salsa one night and just decided, let me build a framework. Like now you can actually start to think, hey, I can have this model, take that as context and actually generate syntactically and even semantically meaningful tests for Pepe's framework, right? So these are the kinds of things that like this enables, right? And so any questions? So this, at least I got through the demos, nothing bombed. But any questions so far on anything here? If not, I'm gonna wrap up and then we can just take general questions. But anything here specifically that we want to talk on the practical side? Oh, yeah, actually, hold on. Yeah.
Yeah, this way.
Hey.
Thanks, very impressive.
Yeah, I try to do my best, man. I learn from the best.
You're okay.
Yeah.
So a few questions. First of all, about these plugin for the. So if I understand correctly, the typical use case is to generate a unit test or code. Do you have use cases to generate the code itself based on requirements, let's say?
Yeah, so something like a GitHub Copilot. Well, first of all, I don't know what happened there. Oh, my machine logged out. All right, we're fine. So it's not necessarily the typical use case. There's just this example, and this project was a unit testing project. I have another project that I used to demo as well that is API level testing, right? It's just code generation. So it's not really based on the level of testing. It just depends on your needs. You can certainly do this to generate like UI level tests as well. Any kind of code, right? Can you use this approach to also generate like production code? Yes, you can. We haven't done that because like our primary focus here has been like leveling up the testing tools, right? Because like there's quite frankly like a lot of motion around like code generation and those things with Copilot and other tools and platforms. I mean, even like thinking about code quality, like Amazon Code Whisperer, like there's a lot of other tools that are kind of focused on that. But of course, like testing doesn't, well, there are some testing features in some of these other tools as well. But this one is primarily like focusing on the testing perspective and any kind of testing code generation that, you know, is meaningful within IDE. I'm just going to wrap up one thing to close it out, and then we can go back to our regularly scheduled programming. All right, so just to kind of wrap this up, right? Like I kind of talked through this, but it's just important since I'm going to share the slides as well, like that we just understand. Like you can have a private setup, and that's what AI DAL brings. All of the stuff that you see, like Alita, is sitting behind a very secure firewall that's all within EPAM's infrastructure. Nothing has left the building, but hasn't left EPAM's walls, right? And then you can have different models and interfaces integrated. Like I showed you, like across the kind of different aspects of whether or not it goes into the communication channels or the IDEs. Like there's things like report portal and other aspects of this that are also important to recognize. And other uses of AI, like for synthetic test data generation or for doing test impact analysis and maintenance and so on and so forth, right? So hopefully this was useful, like, and that you kind of get the idea and the point that like we need to think very holistically about how AI fits, and that there's a lot of things that you can do with this tooling. And then the other big part, which is to come, maybe in another talk later on this year, is like, how do you go about like really testing this stuff to make sure that it works adequately? I just posted some articles on LinkedIn. So if you follow me, you can certainly take a look at those, but thank you.